Welcome to the CharityVillage Connects podcast. A recent TELUS Mental Health Index indicates that employees experiencing workplace conflict lose up to 55 days in productivity per year. The impacts of conflict at work are clear. Lost productivity, but also stress and diminished mental health for the staff who experience it. In this episode, we explore the contributing factors, including power dynamics, racism and microaggressions, and mounting workloads. We'll outline an organization's legal requirements to take action and leave you with some practical solutions and strategies. Please welcome Sarah Albo, a conflict coach and qualified mediator who works with employees and organizations to manage conflict in their workplace. She founded Novel HR to support organizations to improve the mental health and well-being of their employees through a focus on conflict resolution. Sarah is also a CMHA certified psychological health and safety advisor and is passionate about using this framework to help organizations understand the impacts of improving mental health in the workplace. Welcome to the podcast, Sarah.
Hi, Mary. Thanks so much for having me on.
Let's start off with a bit of a definition. What exactly is conflict? I'm sure many of our audiences have their own ideas based on personal experience, but is there a generally accepted definition of conflict in the workplace?
So I actually went and looked this up. I always like to have the dictionary definition of, so we've got a foundation. They're all doing something a little bit different with it. Like there's different nuances with the definition, but they often include words like disagreement, argument, fight, battle. Words or situations that most people would rather avoid. So let me provide a couple distinctions here. This one comes from one of my mentors, Cindy Noble. She's one of the founders of the conflict coaching field, and she talks about the difference between a conflict and a dispute. So a conflict is where there's a disagreement, but it's coming from one person's perspective. So the other person or persons may not realize that there's a problem just yet. So it's an interpersonal situation that's causing us internal distress. It's our mental struggle that comes from incompatible or opposing needs, ideas, wishes, often involves our values, needs, or identity being challenged, threatened, or undermined. And then when the conflict is externalized, so it's out of our heads and the other person's aware, then it's referred to as a dispute. A lot of people use the terms conflict and dispute interchangeably. I know I certainly do. I probably will today here with you. But I think it's an important distinction. It's come up a number of times with clients. They think there's a conflict and they aren't sure how to address it. But part of this is because the other person isn't aware of it, or they don't know what the other person's awareness is. So it adds a level of difficulty for people because they don't know what to expect. And then there's another distinction to make. We've got constructive and destructive conflict. When we talk about the difference between constructive and destructive conflict, it's usually the destructive version that we're referring to as what people are avoiding or afraid of, and rightfully so. It can be extremely difficult to handle. So destructive conflict is characterized by more of a focus on the person than the problem, might have higher emotional intensity, group functioning decreases, and you tend to see more in the way of behaviors that either prolong or escalate the conflict. Like on one hand, we might see avoidance, and on the other, we might see more trying to win at all costs or hostility. With constructive conflict, we might disagree, but there's a level of safety and trust involved where it's a conversation, not necessarily a conflict that's going to escalate. We're able to do more problem solving. We're focusing on the task at hand. We're keeping personal attacks out of the conversation. So this is more of an us versus the problem mentality rather than a me versus you. And we've got both of these happening in the workplace, but it's the destructive conflict that's causing some of the issues that you mentioned, the lower productivity, turnover, leaves, and those, the stress on employees. Constructive conflict, we're always going to have. We're always going to have differences of opinion and that kind of thing. So in the workplace, that's common, and that's not necessarily going to be a problem. That can actually be a really good thing to have. It's the destructive version that is what's causing all of these costs and issues.
And when it comes to workplace conflict, how do emotions come into play? How do they potentially heighten or escalate an already heated situation?
That's typically what emotions do. They tend to be a cause and a driver of destructive conflict. So they bring it up and they keep it going. Not to say that emotions are bad or negative. Some may be harder to deal with, like frustration or sadness, but emotions are really important because they give us information about what our needs are, how we may have been impacted in a situation. It's when we act based on these initial and personal emotions that we can start to see some destructive behaviors and conflict. So I find it helpful to keep in mind we don't choose the emotions we experience or to what intensity. So by acknowledging them and taking some time to understand them, we can take this information and try to incorporate it into the conversation in a way that's constructive. I also think it's important to consider when an emotion's affecting us strongly, is this a now emotion or is this a back then emotion? So is there something in our past that the current situation's bringing up that can escalate a conflict? And that's something to watch out for when the intensity of the conflict doesn't seem to match the current situation.
Good point. So almost a triggering event of past conflict. Why is it important to manage our emotions when we're in a conflict situation? How does this help us to better work towards resolutions?
So when we say manage, excuse me, I want to be cognizant that we're not just trying to make them go away. Emotions give us important information. So what's coming up and why? If we're just ignoring them and trying to push them down or away, that typically doesn't work. They're likely going to come out somewhere else and not necessarily in a constructive way. If we're trying to ignore them in the conflict, it's likely that they're coming out in other ways, like our tone of voice, our nonverbal behaviors. So we're going to be giving an indication to the other person somehow, and then we're opening up ourselves to their interpretation of that rather than communicating it authentically with them. So we want to be recognizing our emotions, naming them can be helpful, sharing them with the other person if you feel safe to do so, and I'll give a script for that in a second. This is where a lot of people struggle. We don't necessarily have a system for working with our emotions when they come up. A lot of this work it's work that we do away from the conflict. So developing our emotional vocabulary, that's also called emotional granularity, where we're better able to label our experience and understand the nuance of it. So taking some space if we feel like we're overwhelmed by our emotions, being able to communicate our experience to the other person without blame or even saying something inappropriate. Like, how can we articulate our thoughts and feelings in a way that can be heard? So one way to do this is to express the emotion we're experiencing and our reasoning behind it, not putting blame on the other person, because that's likely to turn this into a destructive conflict. So in the workplace, this might sound like, I'm frustrated because I expected to be informed that there was going to be a delay with the project. So we're using because we're taking responsibility for our emotions. Not to say that we're not going to address the other person's behavior. We can still do that by putting forward a request after we understand their perspective as well. So that might sound like, I'm frustrated because I expected to be informed that there was going to be a delay with this project. It's really important that we're working together on this. So I'd like to understand what happened and what stopped you from coming to me with this so we can ensure it doesn't happen again. So this is coming from Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. It's a great communication tool for communicating our experience and needs.
Well, sometimes conflict is happening, but one or more of the involved parties try to avoid it. We certainly know a lot of folks do have that sort of fear of conflict and avoidance, I guess, instincts kick in when they believe that they're experiencing or they're feeling emotions related to conflict. What are some of the common fears people have about addressing conflict in the workplace?
So this is a big one. Avoidance is a very common strategy in workplaces. There was a study a couple years ago. They surveyed about 1,000 people in the workplace, and about 70% of them were responding that they were handling conflict by avoiding it. So it's, this is what comes up a lot in the workplaces. Some of the fears that I hear are not wanting to get hurt ourselves, the fear of hurting someone else, thinking nothing will change even if they face the conflict, or the fear that things will potentially get worse, like some form of retaliation. When people are feeling like their job security is at stake, it's really easy to see how they would use avoidance as a strategy or wanting to stay away from a dispute. I also often hear managers say that they just don't want to get involved, and I get that they feel that they don't want to pick sides, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Some managers don't feel like they have the capacity or the skill set to handle conflict, workplace conflict. Definitely something I encourage people to work on as a leadership capability. Because when you're able to support members of your team through conflict, you're modeling a workplace where issues will be handled constructively. Builds trust because people are willing to talk about issues and come to you with them. You're getting better team functioning because these things are being addressed and people aren't just working off the assumptions and expectations of others.
And what are some tips for people looking to manage their reaction to conflict? Do you have some practical advice?
We talked a little bit about this earlier. It's typically the work you do outside of the conflict that will make it easier for you to deal with once you're in it. So this is, partially doing our own work to understand our emotional reactions. What are some of the things or behaviors that bother us more than others? Balancing what's appropriate for us to comment on because it's related to an organizational outcome, or is it just a preference of ours? It's also really important in workplace conflict that we try to understand what's going on for the other person as well, keeping in mind that there are two, maybe more perspectives in the situation. Often they're both right. Another tip you can use is to try to engage your curiosity around that. So another script that I find helpful is to say, I'm noticing and I'm wondering. So for example, this might be someone saying, I'm noticing that we've had less communication recently, and I'm wondering if we could work on that, or I'm wondering if I've done something to impact your willingness to bring up issues to me. So you're pointing out a behavior that's having an impact on an organizational outcome, and you're giving the other person the space to share their perspective on what's happening for them, as opposed to just making an accusation based on our own assumptions and expectations. Something else that really helps is involving appreciation and gratitude. So we're bringing something positive that the employee's done into the conversation. This helps to give us a foundation that we can build on, but we're also bringing more safety to the conversation. I was just reading a study the other day that expressing gratitude to teammates helps reduce cardiovascular responses. So this is something else that happens when our stress response is activated. We're more likely to have an emotional response that may not be constructive to the conversation. So gratitude is actually having a mediating effect on supporting the calming of someone's physiology, more likely to keep that emotional intensity down. Like when we're feeling safe and supported, we're likely not feeling that kind of emotional intensity.
Well, you mentioned something I found quite interesting about how managers need to have training in conflict resolution. And we all know that nonprofit workplaces, managers often will play and wear many, many hats, including taking on a management role. And one of the experts I spoke to talked about how somebody may be very good in doing a task or a number of skills, and so they get promoted without any sort of management experience or training. And that's quite common in the nonprofit sector because of the lower amount of resources. Can you comment on the impact and I guess the importance of this given the nonprofit kind of workplace and the stresses that people are under in the nonprofit sector?
Absolutely. I think you've got, it's two completely different skill sets. Like being good at your job is one thing, managing people is entirely another. And that, we don't often get training. It's a completely different skill set that we need to learn to be able to give instructions to people, give them constructive feedback when necessary, motivation, even just, hiring and promoting on your team. It's people skills versus task skills. So I do encourage managers to, training may not always be available. Like I know, nonprofits have limited resources, and we want to make sure that that's going to their mission. But the development of people as they progress in their careers is so important. So just, a few things that people can do. Look to some of your own leaders, managers that you've really been able to engage with. You found them to be really motivating and fair across their team and in their workplace. What are some of the skill sets that they've had that have been something that's worked for you? What ways have you seen them motivate their team? What have they done when things get hard? How have they managed conflict in their organization? I've talked to a number of clients around this where My HR degree is from years and years ago. I didn't have any conflict resolution training in that. This is something that I've been doing, it's specific training over the years. So I understand that people aren't coming to these positions necessarily with these skill sets, but there is information out there. These are learnable skills. But like we talked before, we have some innate characteristics that can be very conducive to conflict resolution. And that's our curiosity, that's empathy, that's kindness. Even if you don't, if you're not trained as a mediator, that's okay. You can still hold some of these qualities and bring those to your conversations.
Now, how an individual, excuse me, how an individual works to address conflict isn't the only factor. The workplace environment also plays a large role. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the impact of culture, the environment in which they work, the nature of the work that they do?
I'm so glad you asked this, because I want to make sure that we're not just blaming individuals for conflict in the workplace. Like, I don't want people thinking, we're just trying to get them to be more resilient in the face of inappropriate workplace behavior, or that a display of emotions is a problem. I always encourage, consider what's going on in the workplace that might be leading to the behavior that's causing the conflict. Like, if, for example, if you're considering somebody like, oh, this person's passive aggressive, well, what might be going on in the workplace that's leading to this kind of behavior, as opposed to just looking at it as a personal failing or a characteristic. So just some examples of places you can look. Are there policies and procedures that may not be appropriate anymore, that are impacting how people behave? Or are they being applied fairly across all groups? Does the workplace culture encourage behaviors that might lead to conflict, like ultra-competitiveness or the need for power, the concentration for power? Is it behavior, is behavior that causes conflict, is that being addressed, or is it ignored? Are we holding people accountable, and how are we holding people accountable? Is that also being applied fairly across all groups? What happens when people speak up? Are they labeled troublemakers, or does nothing ever change? Are people from marginalized groups more impacted because of bias? There's all sorts of ways that the organization could be impacting the level of conflict in the workplace. And the more that they're able to have trust, care, reliability, and responsibility as part of their culture, the more people are able, they're better able to have what might be tough conversations. And I also think it's important to keep in mind, when we're talking about an organizations, it's a collection of people. So it's still the people in the organization that are engaging in this type of either what's supporting conflict as being constructive, or encouraging it as being more destructive. And so, people in higher levels of the hierarchy, what can they do to model and support some of the behaviors that may be more constructive here?
And at what point should mediation be considered? Can you give us some insight into what the process might look like for an organization considering going in that direction? Are there signs or signals that they should be looking for as to when mediation is necessary, critically important for resolving the issues?
So this might be a little bit of a surprise, but I actually encourage mediation at any time. The earlier, the better. It doesn't have to be when a situation has escalated to a point of, employees not speaking to each other, or you're considering legal action. So this is also why I think it's a skill that managers would be well served to learn as part of their leadership development. I'll give you a little bit of a foundation on mediation. What happens there, the mediator is there to facilitate the conversation. They're not there to find fault or place blame. They're there to maintain a forward focus on coming to a resolution and to encourage the parties to co-create that. So the mediator's not there to decide or impose an outcome. And I think this is a huge benefit of mediation. Here, the parties have control of the outcome. You wouldn't get that in litigation. So if an organization is looking to hire someone independent from them, there's resources online. You could, a Google search will find you a mediator in your area. There's associations here in Canada that provide lists of mediators that you can contact. For example, I'm a member of the ADR Institute of Ontario. Some mediators specialize in a particular area, so looking for a workplace mediator. There are lawyers who mediate as well, but I would just recommend somebody that has specifically mediation training. Most mediators will do a consultation with you to ensure that your situation is a fit for mediation, like both parties are willing to participate, because mediation is a voluntary process. Once you've selected the person you want to work with, then you really just need to set aside the time to meet. And depending on the situation, that might be as little as a half day or even a full day, depending on the situation. And so, that being said, you can see where, if we just sit together and spend a half day on this, as opposed to some of the costs we talked about earlier over the course of the year, it may not seem like it, but conflict really adds up. And so a concentrated process like this and an effort to resolve it can really go a long way. So it's a little, a short term for long-term benefits. And I think it's important to note mediation isn't appropriate as a punishment for an employee when there's safety concerns, but in general, it can be a valuable process to get to a resolution rather than a conflict just dragging on and not being dealt with. One of the things that I've seen with mediation is just having the space to share our experience, to be heard and understood. That in and of itself can shift the conflict dynamic, even if it's something that's gone on for a long time or seems like it's unsolvable. And so that's something that I also believe managers can do that as well. You can hold space for people and demonstrate a care and concern for their experience and their perspective.
So as we wrap up, are there any final thoughts or advice that you'd like to share?
Yes, thanks for asking. Again, I encourage people to try and resolve their workplace conflicts early and often. This is typically when there's lower stress, lower costs, and you have control over the process and outcome. When they get escalated or prolonged, stress levels go up, costs can go up if you need to involve outside professionals, and then you start to lose control over the process and the outcome. So like that's moving more towards litigation. And again, I always like to remind people, you've got some of the foundational skills for conflict resolution, and they're learnable skills, but we've got our curiosity, our empathy, and kindness when we're finding ourselves in challenging situations like this.
Well, Sarah, thank you for your insights into these really important workplace issues and your very, very helpful advice. Thanks for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thanks for having me, Mary.